Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar on calculating customer risk score. My name is Anu Sood, and I'm the Director of Marketing at CaseWare RCM and today's moderator. In the first webinar of the series, we covered how to use profile and relationship information in risk scoring. We followed it with a presentation on what to look for in transactions and behaviors. In today's session, we're going to look at geographic risk and some of the tools that you can use to calculate a country's risk score. A little bit about our presenter today. Laurie Kelly has a 35-year career spanning the fields of accounting, finance, risk management, and regulatory compliance. Most recently, she served as the Director of Compliance for CoBank ACB, a $130 billion farm credit system, where she developed and managed the bank's anti-money laundering, fraud, and economic sanctions and compliance programs. She holds CAMS designation as well as the CAMS audit specialization, and she helped found the ACAMS Colorado chapter and served as the executive board chair and programs director. With that, I'd like to pass the presentation over to Laurie.
Well, thank you, Anu, and hello, everyone. And once again, welcome to this final segment of our three-part series on elements of customer risk. Now, before we begin the webinar today, I'd just like to say I hope you, your families, and your loved ones are all healthy and well and making it through this tumultuous time. And I'm honored that you're taking time out of your day to participate in our webinar with all that's going on right now. So today we're going to start with an exploration of just what is risk and why assess geographic risk. And next, we'll explore the concepts underlying country money laundering risk and some options for building a country money laundering risk model. And then we'll go deep into the detailed risk factors that impact a country's money laundering risk. We'll talk about ways to put all of this together and then wrap up with some concluding comments. And after that, we'll open it up for your questions. So when we talk about risk, what exactly do we mean? Well, there are many ways to define risk, but I kind of like this one. To take a risk is to intentionally interact with uncertainty. And uncertainty is something that may or may not occur, which we can't predict if or when it may occur, and we can't control whether or not it will occur. And in the first two webinars in this series, we've been talking about customer risk. So just to be clear, in the context of anti-money laundering, it's the risk that your customer may conduct money laundering activity or other financial crimes through their account with your institution that you don't detect. So therefore, later on, when this activity comes to light, it could subject you to all kinds of regulatory, financial, and reputational heartache. Now, let's be clear. Any new or existing customer has the potential to use the bank for illegal activity. That's where the uncertainty piece comes in. Now, obviously, without customers, we'd have no risk, but we'd also have no business either. So we look for ways to manage this risk rather than eliminate it altogether. And it's important to recognize that everyone perceives risk differently in any given situation. And I've found this to be especially true when it comes to customer money laundering risk. Now, as AML professionals, our world revolves around this, so it's important that we have a heightened awareness of what makes a customer or a country at higher risk for money laundering activity. Now, there are many different risk factors that come into play when we're assessing a customer's money laundering risk. So many, in fact, that it's logical to group them into categories. The most widely accepted categorizations are what are in this pie chart. Now, in this chart, each risk category appears to have an equal share of the total risk, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. Now, the first category is customer profile and relationships, which we explored during the first webinar in our series. These are the risk factors that are associated with the characteristics of a customer. And especially for a legal entity customer, it's relationships to other individuals and other legal entities. The next category is products, services, activities, and behaviors. And we covered this in the second webinar. It includes all the things the customer will do or is doing through your institution. In essence, it's about how the products and services the customer uses, and their transactional activities and behaviors or patterns of behavior can have a higher money laundering risk. So if you think about it, the first category is about who the customer is. The second category is about what the customer does, and the third category, geographic risk, is about where the customer does it. It being payments, both incoming and outgoing, locations of assets, business relationships, and so forth. This is then tied to the money laundering risk associated with individual countries, which is what we're talking about today. These country money laundering risk scores come into play when you're evaluating how risky are the places where your customer is sending or receiving funds or has other significant connections. Okay, now, why should we assess geographic money laundering risk as part of a customer's risk score? Well, as I just alluded to, the places where funds are going to or coming from can be a money laundering risk factor, as can be the places where a customer is domiciled, has business affiliates, or actively engages in trade. And assessing geographic money laundering risk really comes down to assessing the potential risk posed by individual countries. Now, once we have a means to say that a particular country has a high money laundering risk or terrorist financing risk, then when a customer has transaction activity with counterparties in that country, we can then flag and evaluate those transactions. And the same goes with customer due diligence research. If a customer, say, has an affiliated entity, such as a parent or subsidiary company, in a high-risk country, then we want to find out more about it and potentially label this customer as higher risk. It is important to recognize, though, that geographic risk alone does not necessarily determine a customer's or a transaction's risk level, either positively or negatively. So what does make a country at a higher risk for money laundering or terrorist financing activity? Well, the answer is a lot of things. Unfortunately for AML professionals, there is no real standardized way to measure this. And that's because much of what goes into this risk is very subjective, immeasurable, or it's based on perceptions, as you'll see later on. We have to find a way to quantify all of the regulatory, legal, political, and financial indicators that influence a country's vulnerability to money laundering and terrorist financing. It's a complex and a multidimensional issue. But it's important to recognize from the beginning that doing this is not going to result in factual or quantitative measurements of actual money laundering or terrorist financing activity. Nobody's figured out how to measure that yet, and honestly, probably never will. So what are the various indicators that a country has a higher money laundering risk? Well, they fall into one of four high-level categories. First is the quality of a particular country's AML CFT regulatory framework. And by the way, CFT stands for Countering the Financing of Terrorism. Second, a country's degree of financial transparency and regulatory standards around it. Third, the level of bribery and corruption within a country. And last but not least, a country's involvement in or support of sanctioned activities, such as illegal narcotics production, support of terrorism, or human rights abuses, for example. And we'll go into each of these in more detail next, along with available data sources. But before we go into the details of all the risk indicators, I want to get you thinking about how you would build a methodology for compiling these indicators and turning them into risk scores. Well, the first way would be to not build it yourself at all. For the past 8 years, the not-for-profit Basel Institute on Governance, which is based in Basel, Switzerland, has been compiling an annual AML index by country. Now, it's the only independent, research-based index that ranks countries according to their risk of money laundering and terrorist financing. And it provides risk scores based on the quality of a country's AML CFT framework, and other factors like perceived levels of corruption, financial sector standards, and public transparency, political and legal risks associated with media freedom, and the strength of the rule of law. Now, what you see here is the cover of the most recent edition, the 8th, which was published in August of 2019. I really wish this would have been available when I built my own AML country risk model, but I was pleased to see that the inputs I used in my model are, for the most part, also used by Basel. Now, the public edition of the Basel AML Index covers 125 countries, and it has a limited amount of detail. Now, of course, if you want the expert edition, you have to pay for it, but you get lots more detail and rankings of 203 countries, as well as some really great interactive stuff. Now, the Basel AML Index is fantastic. It's extremely well researched and documented, and it does all the heavy lifting for you. Now, this image is a snapshot of the 2019 rankings. In my opinion, though, you would need to take the Basel results a step further to be able to incorporate them into your customer risk scoring and transaction monitoring. It also leaves out some things I believe are important factors, especially for US institutions. And these could even be relevant for other countries as well. And I'll talk about those a little later. If you still want to build your own customized country risk scoring model, you can certainly do so. You can build it from the ground up, or start with Basel's rankings and then add on to it. And I'll talk about each approach as we go through the remainder of the presentation. Now let's get into some more details. We're going to start with the risk indicators that measure the quality of a country's AML and CFT regulations. And when we talk about a country's AML and CFT regulatory framework, we're really getting into how well designed their regulations are and how effective they are in mitigating risks of money laundering. There are three primary sources of this kind of information. We're going to go deeper into each one of these coming up, but just to summarize. The first is data from the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, evaluations of its member countries' AML and CFT regulations. The second is the U.S. Treasury's designations of entities and jurisdictions of primary money laundering concern. And the third is whether a country is designated as a major money laundering country in the U.S. State Department's annual INCSR, or International Narcotics Control Strategy Report, which is quite a mouthful. Now, two of these factors are used in the Basel AML Index for this category, and all three are what I used in my country risk scoring model. First, let's talk some more about FATF. The Financial Action Task Force is the global money laundering and terrorist financing watchdog, if you will. Now, they're not a regulator. Instead, what they do is establish international standards for AML and CTF regulations that their member countries agree to abide by. These standards are called the FATF recommendations. The FATF has 39 member countries, and there are also nine FATF-style regional bodies that cover various geographical regions of the world. Now, these have an important role in promoting the FATF recommendations by their member countries. So in total, over 200 countries have agreed to implement the FATF recommendations. Now, the FATF also monitors its member countries to ensure they implement the FATF standards fully and effectively, and they hold these countries to account that don't comply. The FATF performs what are called mutual evaluations of each member country about once every 7 or 8 years. It just takes that long to get through every country because each evaluation can take over a year. Now, if weaknesses are identified, the country is monitored closely and reports back regularly to the FATF on the actions it's taking to address those weaknesses. Now, the FATF also calls out countries that it considers to be high-risk jurisdictions. Now, these countries have significant strategic deficiencies in countering money laundering or terrorist financing, as well as financing weapons of mass destruction. By calling out these countries, FATF urges all jurisdictions to apply enhanced due diligence and, in the most serious cases, countermeasures to protect the international financial system from the risks these countries present. This list is often referred to as the FATF blacklist, and currently North Korea and Iran are the only two countries on it. So how does FATF data fit into a country risk scoring model? Well, for the Basel AML index, I can't say for sure. They indicate that there's a lot of professional judgment that goes into the score they give each country based on the results of the mutual evaluations, as well as what they do with countries the FATF has identified as having some significant deficiencies in their AML regulatory framework, but aren't on the blacklist. Now, in my simplified model, I just considered a country's FATF membership to be a risk mitigator. So I would use a negative point value for that country. If instead the country was a member of a FATF-style regional body, I still considered this a risk mitigator, but not as much as being an actual FATF member. And this is because the mutual evaluation process is dictated by the regional body, and it can vary significantly. I then would add a high point value to any country that was on the FATF blacklist. Now, these point values are just illustrations of how a simplified model might work. They're certainly not set in stone, and you could, of course, choose your own values. The second risk indicator relating to a country's AML and CFT regulatory framework is the U.S. Treasury Department's designation of countries as being of primary money laundering concern. You may also hear this called special measures. These are actually administered through the Treasury's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, or FinCEN. And these designations come about through Section 311 of the USA Patriot Act, which gives the Secretary of the Treasury the authority to designate a foreign country or financial institution, class of transaction, or type of account as being of primary money laundering concern. What this means is that domestic financial institutions must take certain special measures against the entity of primary money laundering concern. Now, these special measures range from requiring additional due diligence and data collection for certain accounts or transactions to completely prohibiting any correspondent or payable through accounts. And each designee has specific special measures imposed on them. Now, historically, most of the designees have been financial institutions, but there have been a number of countries designated over the years. Now, most of these have since been rescinded, but these remain in place: Iran, North Korea, and Burma, or more accurately, Myanmar. And the image you see here is just an excerpt from the list, which you'll find on FinCEN's website. Now, Burma is a unique one because U.S. economic sanctions on it were lifted in 2016. However, the special measures remain in place, but with something called an administrative exception. This allows U.S. financial institutions to provide correspondent services to Burmese banks, subject to, of course, appropriate due diligence requirements. Now, Treasury says this exception is based on Burma's progress in improving its anti-money laundering regime and its commitment to continue making progress to address money laundering, corruption, and narcotics-related activities. Now, supposedly, Treasury intends to eventually rescind the designation completely when and if they decide Burma has made sufficient progress in anti-money laundering. Now, the Basel Index does not use this particular indicator. And now I'm just speculating here, but this could be because it's a uniquely American thing. Now, similarly, Basel doesn't consider the United States economic sanctions on countries as a risk indicator either. Now, we'll talk about these sanctions in an upcoming section, but you could choose to incorporate this as a risk factor, either in a simplified model or a modified Basel model where you'd add extra point values to reflect this higher risk. Now, our last factor under AML and CFT regulatory framework is used in the Basel Index, although it is a US publication, but it's not specific to US regulations, so maybe that's why. And what we're talking about here is an annual publication by the US State Department called the International Narcotics Control Strategy Report, or INCSR for short. Now, the INCSR is a country-by-country, two-volume report that describes the efforts of the US government to attack all aspects of the international drug trade and its related money laundering and other financial crimes. What we're most interested in is Volume 2, which is called Money Laundering and Financial Crimes. The US government researches and reports findings on each country's laws and regulations to prevent narcotics-related money laundering. Those that are designated as a major money laundering country are those where their financial institutions are believed to engage in transactions involving significant proceeds from international narcotics trafficking. Now keep this in mind when you see the list of these countries. And here they are, all the countries included in the 2020 INCSR report. Now, it's important to note that a country being included on this list doesn't necessarily mean they're not making efforts to combat money laundering or that they haven't fully met international AML standards. It's not a blacklist and there aren't any sanctions associated with it, which I suppose is a good thing because the US has listed itself as a major money laundering country. And while the report includes detailed narratives on each listed country and the current state of its AML regulatory framework, it doesn't do so for the United States. Gee, I wonder why. Anyway, many of these listed countries are not unexpected, and they will show up under other risk factors as well, as you'll soon see. Now let's move on to the next two categories of risk indicators relating to financial transparency and levels of bribery and corruption. The lack of financial transparency is the primary driver in illicit funds movement around the world. The Tax Justice Network estimates that as much as 32 trillion is held in offshore wealth. The Financial Transparency Coalition estimates that 80% or more of these assets are unreported, representing billions in lost tax revenues to those countries where the income was generated. Now, lost tax revenues mean less money for schools, roads, healthcare, and other basic human needs. Now, exposés like the Panama Papers from a few years ago have given us a closer look into the magnitude of this issue. Now, countries that are in effect selling secrecy are at the heart of this. Transactions to and from these countries without a clear, legitimate business purpose should be considered high risk and examined closely for possible suspicious activity reporting. So where do we find data on countries that promote financial secrecy? Well, Basel's AML index states that its underlying data for this risk element is obtained from the International Monetary Fund and the World Economic Forum. And Basel looks for indicators like strength of auditing requirements, business disclosures, regulation of securities exchanges, and quality of financial standards. So Basel's experts are doing a lot of research to come up with their scoring for this risk element. But in my own opinion, for a country risk scoring model, I'd rather have data that's a bit more concrete, verifiable, and relatively easy to update. The data source I recommend is what's called the Financial Secrecy Index, which we'll go into next. I should mention, though, that Basel does use this Financial Secrecy Index, but they put it under the first category we talked about, the AML-CTF regulatory framework. So just a slightly different approach to how financial secrecy data is incorporated in their model. And the image you see here is of a report put together by the International Coalition of Investigative Journalists. That was the group that published the Panama Papers, and the Center for Public Integrity. And it's a fascinating report, and you can get it at the link that's shown at the bottom of the slide. The Financial Secrecy Index ranks jurisdictions according to their secrecy and the scale of their offshore financial activities. It's a politically neutral ranking meant to be a tool for understanding global financial secrecy, tax havens or secrecy jurisdictions, and illicit financial flows or capital flight. It's updated every year and was most recently published in February of 2020. It's compiled by an organization called the Tax Justice Network. Now, their stated core mission is to, quote, change the weather on a wide range of issues relating to tax havens, and financial globalization by pushing for systemic change. And their website is excellent. The FSI rankings are provided in a downloadable format with links to detailed narrative reports on every country. And what you're seeing here are the top 15 for 2020. Now, some of these are no surprise, where others seem somewhat unexpected, like Japan or Germany. Now, the top 5 countries vary from year to year in their position within the top 5, but pretty much the same countries are consistently present in that group. And that includes the United States. If you're based in the US, do you know why? Well, it's because, number one, we still have no regulations regarding formal, verified disclosure and reporting by companies of their beneficial owners. We allow corporate formation agents to establish shell companies with nominee owners, and we essentially promote anonymous corporate formation. But you don't have to take my word for it. The Tax Justice Network's website will give you an exact breakdown of every factor that contributes to each country's overall score. It's really a tremendous resource. So how would you take this information and build it into a country risk score model? Well, my approach was to take the top 15 countries each year and give those countries a particular point value. Now, if you wanted to, you could even weight them based on how risky you perceive particular countries, based on your institution's customer demographics. Now, corruption and bribery are very common predicate offenses to money laundering. Countries with a high exposure or vulnerability to corruption are at a greater risk of money laundering because the proceeds of corruption have to be laundered. So what's the difference between the two? Well, corruption is defined as dishonest or fraudulent conduct by those in power. For example, a public official who selects vendors for government contracts based on how those contracts will benefit them personally. Now, bribery, on the other hand, is a form of corruption, and it's defined as illegal flow of money or other valuables from a private entity to a public official in exchange for being granted a government service or a privilege. Now, there are 2 excellent sources for this information, both of which are used by the Basel Index. They are Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index and the Trace Bribery Risk Matrix. So let's talk about each one of these. An organization called Transparency International develops and publishes the annual Corruption Perceptions Index, or CPI. Now, its mission is to work together with governments, businesses, and citizens to stop the abuse of power, bribery, and secret deals. Every year, the CPI ranks 180 countries and territories by their perceived levels of perceived public sector corruption, according to experts and business people. The 2019 analysis, which was published in early 2020, illustrates just how corruption is more pervasive in the countries where big money can flow freely into electoral campaigns and where governments listen pretty much only to the voices of the wealthy or the well-connected. Now, what's slightly different about the CPI is that the higher the score, the lower the level of corruption. So each of the 180 countries can have a score ranging from 0, which is highly corrupt, to 100, which is very clean. Now here's a snapshot of the most recent index rankings showing the bottom 5 or most corrupt countries. And here are the top 5 or least corrupt ones. Now you'll note also that sometimes countries have the same score. For example, New Zealand and Denmark are tied for the top spot at 87. In case you're wondering, the United Kingdom was tied with Canada, Australia, and Austria with 77, and the United States and France both had the same score of 69. Remember, the higher the score, the less corruption. So now let's talk about the second data source, the Trace Bribery Risk Matrix, and then we'll go into how you might incorporate these into a simplified model. If you're not familiar with Trace, it's actually two entities. One, Trace International, is a 501c6 nonprofit business association, and it provides multinational companies and their commercial intermediaries with anti-bribery compliance support. The other entity is Trace Incorporated, which provides third-party risk management solutions. The Trace Bribery Risk Matrix, or just Trace Matrix, measures business bribery risk in 200 countries. Now, the overall country risk score is a combination of subscores in these 4 areas: business interactions with government, anti-bribery deterrence and enforcement, government and civil service transparency, and the capacity for civil society oversight. Now, the Trace Matrix data is available for free from their website, and it's updated annually. The data is in the form of a country score, where the higher the score, the higher the risk. So just the opposite of the Corruption Perceptions Index. Now here are the top and bottom 5 for 2019 with their scores. In case you're curious, the US had a score of 18, the UK score was 11, and Canada's was 14. Now remember, the higher the score, the greater the bribery risk. Now, both the CPI and the Trace Matrix provide a ranking of the level of corruption risk that individual countries present. But they come at this from slightly different perspectives. The Corruption Perceptions Index is focused on perceived levels of public sector corruption, whereas the Trace Matrix focuses on business or private sector bribery risk. And as I mentioned, the Basel Index uses both of these in their country risk scoring and gives them equal weight. So how might you go about incorporating this into a simplified country risk model if you're not just using the Basel Index? Well, one approach would be to just use their scores, except the problem with this is that they're opposite. The CPI goes from high to low, and the Trace Matrix goes from low to high based on risk. You could convert one of them, so both are equivalent if you're mathematically inclined, or you might want to do what I did, which is to bucket ranges of scores and into categories of high, medium, low, and very low. These bucket score ranges were completely arbitrary on my part, but again, if you're mathematically inclined, you could come up with a statistical means of doing this. But the advantage is that now each country has a risk level instead of a risk score that's comparable between them. Then you determine a point value for each of the risk levels for each index and give each country in your risk model the appropriate point values. Now, as you can see in the sample, countries tend to have the same risk level under both indices, which is probably not too surprising. So if you want to keep your model very simple, just choose one of the 2 indices. If you're going to choose just one, research them both and make an informed decision. But personally, I don't think you'd go wrong with either one. This final risk indicator is tied to a country's involvement in or support of sanctioned activities, such as illegal narcotics production or sponsoring terrorism, for example. Now, individual countries, such as the United States or Canada, or groups of countries like the European Union or the United States, have historically used a variety of sanctions to apply pressure to countries or individuals or groups within countries that threaten peace, have harmful policies, or don't cooperate with international law. And these have ranged from comprehensive economic and trade sanctions to more targeted measures like arms embargoes, travel bans, or financial or commodity restrictions. The Basel AML index doesn't specifically include sanctioned countries in its model, possibly because these tend to be country or region specific. Now, Basel does have a risk factor that they call legal and political risks. And it covers such risks as they're associated with media freedom and the strength of the rule of law in a country. However, it's my opinion that countries on which government sanctions have been imposed should be included in a financial institution's country money laundering risk model. And I think the institution should focus primarily on those sanctions imposed by their home country, unless of course it operates globally, which means a broader approach. However, once sanctions are imposed by one major entity, say the United Nations, everyone else tends to follow suit. Now, in a simplified model, you may wish to consider these countries as very high risk because you'd want to flag transaction activity and dealings your customer may have with these countries for additional due diligence. And now, while a discussion of sanctions is way beyond our scope today, I do want to point out that oftentimes the name of a sanctions program isn't always reflective of who's being sanctioned. And a perfect example of this is the sanctions programs targeting Russia's actions against Ukraine. Now, the EU and the United States both refer to these sanctions as the Ukraine sanctions, but they're clearly not against Ukraine or anyone in that country. So I don't consider Ukraine to be a sanctioned country. Russia, yes. So as you identify these countries, be sure you understand the underlying sanctions and who exactly they're targeting. So we've explored all the major risk factors that come into play when assessing a country's money laundering and terrorist financing risks. The next step is to decide on the model you'll use, which risk factors you'll include, and why. And you have several options. First, you could simply go with the ready-made Basel AML index. Or you could use Basel as a starting point and then add some risk factors you consider important that they don't include, like government-sanctioned countries. A third option would be to build your own simplified model from the ground up. And this really isn't as hard as it sounds. You make a list of all the countries and you basically add point values for each risk factor, as we've talked about. But no matter which option you choose, I do think it's helpful to bucket these numeric scores into named risk level ranges, like high, medium, etc. Or you might prefer terms like highly scrutinized, moderate, etc. But I found this just makes it easier to understand and to then translate into most customer risk scoring models and transaction monitoring systems. So now I'd just like to wrap up with some general recommendations. First, it's important that any institution's risk scoring models be as simple as possible while still maintaining effectiveness. And while country money laundering risk has many complex elements, it's still possible to keep the model relatively straightforward. Whether you choose to use an already developed model like the Basel AML Index or one you build yourself, be sure to obtain or develop and then maintain detailed documentation of the model. You'll want to document as well your rationale for not only the model choice, but the risk factors that it includes. Good documentation provides a clear reference that you can share with regulators, management, internal audit, as well as all relevant compliance staff so they're understanding it. And along these lines, be sure to educate your frontline staff about country money laundering risk factors, especially if your customer base has a lot of foreign dealings. It's important that staff understand not just what the risk factors are, but also why. And especially if your institution deals with other types of country risk, such as country credit risk, it's important to distinguish money laundering risk from other types. Next, as we just alluded to in the poll question, it's important to ensure regular updates to your underlying country risk factors, especially if you're using your own model or a modified version of the Basel Index. Now, some of the underlying data will only be updated annually, like the Corruption Perceptions Index, the INCSR report, and so forth. But FATF often publishes new information about countries, money laundering, and terrorist financing risk as they emerge. So to have a process to ensure an annual update, as well as a periodic review of those factors that can change more frequently. And although it may go without saying, I'll say it anyway, there's not much point in risk scoring your own country, although it can be eye-opening. Now, if your institution is a multinational, you may likely need to score every country and establish the right processes for each location. Finally, I want to re-emphasize that no single risk factor exists in a vacuum. All of a country's risk factors should be considered holistically because, as we've seen, some countries will be low risk in certain areas and high risk in others. Well, thank you so much for participating in today's webinar.
All right, so with that, I would like to thank Laurie for sharing her experience and our attendees for joining today's session, especially during these very extraordinary times. We hope that you can join us for future events and please stay safe. Thank you, and this now concludes our webcast.